Today, we look at what happens when people climb without Sherpas and die on Everest. From TikTokers who burned every bridge of Sherpas trust they had before making their summit push through worsening weather, to a climber who was unaware that he was being guided by someone inexperienced. It was September 14th, 2016, at Mount Rainier National Park in Washington State. Climbers gathered at the Paradise Visitor Center in the early hours, preparing for late-season summit attempts as weather patterns shifted toward colder, less predictable conditions. The parking area was active with teams checking equipment, reviewing forecasts, and coordinating logistics before moving onto the mountain. Above them, the upper slopes of Rainier were already showing signs of seasonal change, with increasing cloud cover and the potential for rapid weather deterioration. The climber at the center of this incident was Akaya Levine, a 34-year-old software engineer from Seattle. He worked as a senior developer for a tech startup in the South Lake Union District and was known for a deliberate, analytical approach to problem solving. In the months leading up to the climb, Levine had gone through a recent divorce and was involved in an ongoing custody dispute over his 8-year-old daughter. He saw mountaineering as a way to cope with mounting personal stress, while those close to him questioned whether the risks he was taking reflected sound judgment. His fitness regimen had intensified dramatically over the past year. 3 evenings per week found him at the Vertical World Climbing Gym in Redmond, working through increasingly difficult boulder problems and top rope routes. Weekend hiking had evolved into scrambling, then into technical rock climbing at locations throughout the Cascades. His apartment walls displayed photographs from successful ascents of Mount Baker, Mount Adams, and several technical rock routes in the North Cascades. Yet Mount Rainier represented something different, a legitimate mountaineering objective that would require skills he had only read about in climbing manuals. The decision to hire a guide had not come easily. Akaya prided himself on self-reliance and had initially planned to attempt the mountain solo. However, research into the Disappointment Cleaver route revealed complexities that exceeded his experience level. Glacier travel, crevasse rescue techniques, and high-altitude route finding were skills that could not be learned from books or weekend climbing trips. After weeks of online research and forum discussions, he had contacted Pemba Sherpa through a mountaineering service that connected clients with freelance guides. Pemba Sherpa, in his early 40s, had grown up in the Khumbu region of Nepal before moving to the United States. His experience was extensive, including multiple high-altitude expeditions in the Himalayas and guiding clients in mountainous regions of the Pacific Northwest. When arranging the Mount Rainier climb, Pemba had quoted a flat fee for a 2-day expedition that included route guidance, technical instruction, and safety oversight. Akaya agreed to the price without negotiation, viewing it as an investment in both safety and learning. The financial arrangement had seemed straightforward. Akaya planned to bring cash for the guide fee and settle any additional expenses afterward. However, as the climb approached, he realized he had only a portion of the agreed amount in cash due to withdrawal limits and personal preferences. He planned to cover the remainder electronically once they returned to an area with cell coverage, believing this solution would satisfy both parties. The route they intended to follow begins at a popular trailhead at around 5,400 feet and ascends to a high-altitude base camp at over 10,000 feet on the first day, with a pre-dawn summit attempt the following day. The climb gains nearly 9,000 feet over roughly 9 miles, with the upper sections requiring travel across glaciers, crevasse navigation, steep snow and ice slopes, and rocky ridges that present significant technical challenges. Mountain weather in the region can change quickly, especially during the transition from summer to fall. Forecasts predicted a limited window of favorable conditions in the early hours, followed by a strong storm moving in from the west. Winds were expected to increase significantly, with heavy snow and near-zero visibility likely later in the day. Temperatures at higher elevations were projected to drop well below freezing, with wind chills reaching extreme levels. Akaya and Pemba met at the trailhead before beginning their climb. Their initial interaction proceeded smoothly as they reviewed route plans, checked weather conditions, and conducted final gear inspections. Pemba examined Akaya's equipment with the practiced eye of someone who had seen clients arrive with inadequate or inappropriate gear. Overall, Akaya's setup was solid: a 4-season mountaineering tent, sleeping bag rated for extreme cold, insulated climbing boots, and technical outerwear. suitable for alpine conditions. However, Pemba noted that his glacier travel gear was minimal, consisting of a basic climbing harness, a single ice axe, and lightweight crampons more suited to hiking than technical climbing. The ascent toward the high-altitude base camp began under partly cloudy skies with light winds. The initial section wound through subalpine meadows before transitioning to a broad snowfield that extended for nearly 2 miles at a steady incline. Akaya maintained a steady pace at first, but the effects of elevation and the weight of his pack quickly became apparent, and he needed frequent pauses to catch his breath and adjust his gear. Pemba observed Akaya's struggles with concern. While the software engineer was clearly in good physical condition, his breathing and movement suggested limited experience with sustained uphill travel under load. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, as if the mountain itself was testing him. The guide had seen this pattern many times before. Clients who excel in gym-based fitness but struggled with the specific demands of mountaineering. Still, Akaya's determination was evident, and he pressed on despite discomfort. They eventually reached the high-altitude camp as the sun began to set. The main shelter was already occupied by other climbing parties, so Akaya and Pemba set up their camp on a nearby flat platform. The evening routine of melting snow for water, preparing a simple meal, and organizing gear for the next day proceeded efficiently. It was during this time that the payment issue first surfaced. As they ate, Akaya brought up the guide fee. He explained that he had brought a portion of the cash, but planned to pay the remainder electronically once cell service was available. He showed evidence of sufficient funds on his smartphone, expecting the matter to be a minor administrative detail. Pemba's reaction was stronger than anticipated. He insisted that full payment was required before beginning the technical portions of the climb. He explained that past clients who promised electronic payments sometimes never followed through, and the guide industry largely operated on cash transactions. His caution reflected hard-earned experience rather than distrust of Akaya personally. Akaya attempted to reassure Pemba by showing additional signs of financial stability, emphasizing that any remaining payment would be completed once they returned to an area with cell service. Despite these reassurances, Pemba remained cautious, having encountered clients in the past who promised payment but failed to follow through. The discussion stretched on as both men tried to find a solution. Akaya offered extra compensation for the inconvenience, while Pemba suggested they could turn back and resume the climb once the payment issue was settled. Neither option satisfied both parties, and they ultimately agreed to proceed, with the understanding that the full payment would be made afterward. Sleep came fitfully for both. Akaya lay awake, replaying the conversation, wondering if he had made a mistake in not bringing enough cash. The combination of altitude, stress, and lingering tension kept him restless. Pemba, meanwhile, considered the risk of guiding a client whose payment was uncertain, aware from experience that financial disputes often reflected broader judgment issues. Before dawn, they began the technical portion of the climb under clear skies with light winds. Headlamps illuminated the path as they roped together and moved across a glacier. The snow conditions were firm, providing good footing for crampons, but Akaya's inexperience quickly became apparent. At this point, even a small misstep could have fatal consequences. What might have been a straightforward section took far longer than anticipated, as the guide provided ongoing instruction in basic mountaineering skills. As they approached the base of the steep upper section, the route became more technical, requiring scrambling over loose rock and careful navigation around crevasses. Akaya's previous rock climbing experience helped his confidence here, but the altitude was beginning to affect him. Frequent pauses were needed to manage breathing and conserve energy, signaling the physical and mental challenges that lay ahead. As the morning light spread across the peaks and glacier-covered slopes, Akaya paused frequently to take photographs, despite Pemba's reminders about the need to maintain their pace. The guide grew increasingly concerned. Their progress was slower than expected, and weather reports indicated conditions could worsen as the day progressed. They had covered only part of the remaining distance to the summit, with the most technical and exposed sections still ahead. At a high point well below the summit, Pemba called for an extended rest to assess their situation. The weather remained deceptively clear, but high clouds were drifting in from the west, darkening the peaks with subtle menace, an ominous warning of a storm that could arrive faster than either of them anticipated. Akaya's energy was visibly waning. His movements were stiff and uneven, a reflection of both physical fatigue and the mental strain of high-altitude exertion. Pemba, ever observant, noted the small signs: labored breathing, lingering pauses to catch his breath, the occasional stumble that suggested muscles were shutting down sooner than they should have. During this pause, Pemba gently suggested the possibility of turning back. He explained that, at their current pace, attempting the summit and returning safely before the storm hit would be unlikely. Every second they lingered increased exposure risk, and the upper slopes offered no margin for error. Akaya's reaction was immediate, forceful, and unyielding. In his mind, he had invested months of preparation, money, and personal sacrifice. To stop now felt like surrender. He dismissed the forecast as overly cautious, insisting that the mountain would hold if they pushed while conditions still allowed, and that hesitation now would be more dangerous than pressing forward. The conversation quickly escalated into an argument. Akaya's frustration and pride sharpened his words. He accused Pemba of exaggerating the danger, even suggesting that the guide's caution was influenced by the unresolved payment issue from the previous evening. Pemba, whose calm demeanor rarely wavered, countered firmly. His judgment was born from 2 decades of high-altitude guiding, where experience had repeatedly proven that even small miscalculations could turn fatal. He emphasized that client safety, not summit ambition, was paramount. The tension that had simmered since the prior night's financial disagreement now erupted fully, a collision of inexperience and expertise, stubborn pride, and hard-earned caution. Around them, the mountain seemed to hold its breath, the faint whisper of wind through the ridges, a subtle reminder that nature was indifferent to human arguments. As the day progressed, the first signs of deteriorating weather became undeniable. Winds howled across the ridges, whipping loose snow into stinging arcs that reduced visibility to mere yards. Clouds thickened, moving rapidly from the west, swallowing distant peaks in a shifting gray void. Pemba's trained eye recognized the pattern instantly. Conditions that had been manageable in the morning were now tipping into a serious hazard. He made the call. It was time to begin descending. Safety, not pride or ambition, had to come first. Akaya's response was immediate and vehement. He refused to turn back, insisting they were close enough to the summit to press on despite the worsening storm. Frustration and fear for the investment he had made, months of preparation, money spent, and personal sacrifices coalesced into defiance. He even threatened to withhold payment if Pemba insisted on retreating, a stark reminder of the unresolved tension that had shadowed them since the previous night. The argument escalated as conditions deteriorated further. Snow drove sideways in sheets, ice forming on exposed gear, while gusts tossed loose rock and snow across the slopes. Pemba repeatedly urged him to descend, warning that the storm would intensify and that continuing upward was now a direct gamble with survival. Temperatures plunged, wind chill, values approaching life-threatening extremes, and both men struggled to maintain warmth and focus despite technical clothing. Faced with an impossible choice, Pemba prepared to descend alone, organizing ropes and checking his harness with practiced precision, fully expecting Akaya to follow. But Akaya unroped himself, ignoring every precaution, and pressed onward. Pride, panic, and stubborn determination collided, leaving him blinded to the danger he faced. He accused Pemba of abandoning him, even hinting at legal consequences. While the guide recognized the grim reality, he could not force a grown man to retreat, yet leaving him alone in such conditions violated every principle of safe guiding. Repeated attempts to persuade Akaya failed. The software engineer was resolute. The mountain's white fury was gathering, and there was nothing left to do but descend and hope that experience would keep one of them alive. As the risks escalate, remember there's a lot we can learn from these accidents. Subscribe and turn on notifications to catch every detailed breakdown of extreme climbing incidents. Ultimately, with whiteout conditions fully established, Pemba began his descent alone. He left Akaya with clear instructions for the route, emergency procedures, and guidance on following established markers. His decision was based on experience. Staying with an uncooperative client in such dangerous conditions would likely have endangered both their lives. Pemba promised to summon help as soon as he reached safety and communication was possible, hoping that the clear instructions and his repeated warnings might be enough to prevent tragedy. Akaya watched Pemba disappear into the swirling snow and immediately regretted his decision to continue alone. But pride, frustration, and stubborn determination anchored him in place. His mind raced between panic and rational thought, and for a fleeting moment, he considered calling out to the guide, or even turning back. But the roar of the wind swallowed his voice. Instead, he shouldered his pack and forced his legs upward into the storm, each step heavy with the weight of fear and exhaustion. The swirling snow blurred every landmark, and the once familiar route dissolved into a vast, featureless expanse. His compass became a futile tool, spinning silently in the blinding whiteness, while snow and ice coated every surface, making footing treacherous and slow. The temperature had dropped to approximately -10 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill values plunging to -30 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Akaya's extremities began to lose feeling despite his insulated gloves and boots, and his fingers stiffened around the ice axe he clutched for stability. Each breath was a struggle, the thin air biting deep into his lungs, carrying the sting of frost into every inhalation. Snowflakes turned to ice as they struck his goggles and face mask, building into layers that obscured vision and stung exposed skin. The weight of his pack, which had seemed manageable in the morning light, now felt impossible, dragging him downward even as he tried to climb upward. His energy reserves, already taxed by the day's exertion, began to fail, and every step demanded a conscious effort to overcome both fatigue and fear. By 11 a.m., the magnitude of his situation sank in. He was lost. The terrain around him was a monotone of gray and white, slopes and ridges indistinguishable from one another, stretching endlessly in every direction. Snow obliterated the tracks he had painstakingly left behind only minutes earlier, erasing any trace of his path. Panic bubbled beneath his exhaustion, a creeping awareness that each choice or misstep could be the last. Alone at nearly 13,000 feet, in a storm that reduced the world to near zero visibility, Akaya faced the stark reality that he had no way to call for help, no clear route to safety, and no guide to intervene. Every instinct screamed danger, yet every step forward became a desperate gamble against the mountain itself. Akaya's attempts at self-rescue became increasingly desperate and disorganized. He wandered in what he thought were systematic search patterns, trying to locate the established climbing route or any recognizable landmarks. However, his movements were actually taking him further from safety and deeper into the crevasse fields that characterized the upper reaches of the Disappointment Cleaver route. The combination of altitude, cold, and stress was impairing his judgment and decision-making abilities. By noon, the first signs of serious hypothermia were becoming apparent. Akaya's fine motor control was deteriorating, making it difficult to operate zippers, adjust his gear, or maintain his grip on his ice axe. His speech became slurred, though there was no one to hear him. Most critically, his ability to think clearly and make rational decisions was compromised by his dropping core body temperature. The wind continued to increase throughout the early afternoon, with sustained speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour and gusts approaching 70 miles per hour. The combination of wind and snow created complete whiteout conditions that extended visibility to less than 10 feet in any direction. Akaya's progress slowed to a crawl as he struggled to maintain his footing on the increasingly icy slopes. Several times he fell and had the difficulty getting back to his feet, a clear indication that his physical coordination was severely compromised. Around 12:30 p.m., Akaya made the decision to seek shelter and wait for the storm to pass. However, his location in the open glacier terrain offered no natural protection from the wind and driving snow. He attempted to dig a snow cave using his ice axe, but his deteriorating motor skills made this task nearly impossible. After 20 minutes of ineffective digging, he abandoned the effort and continued wandering in search of better shelter. Akaya's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The shivering that had kept him moving and alert began to fade, leaving him sluggish and disoriented. Despite the worsening cold, he felt a strange warmth and pressed on, wandering aimlessly across the glacier, unaware of how serious his situation had become. Akaya's movements had become unsteady and erratic. He stumbled frequently and had a difficulty maintaining his balance on the uneven snow surface. His pack, which contained essential survival gear, including his sleeping bag and shelter, felt impossibly heavy. In his confused state, he made the critical decision to abandon the pack in order to move more easily, removing his last realistic chance of surviving the storm through emergency shelter. Without the weight of his pack, Akaya initially felt more mobile and continued his search for the descent route. However, he was now completely exposed to the elements with only the clothing he was wearing for protection. The wind chill at his elevation and in the prevailing conditions was extreme, capable of causing frostbite within minutes and rapidly sapping strength in inadequately protected individuals. His wandering became increasingly random as his cognitive abilities deteriorated further. He was no longer able to maintain any sense of direction or purpose. Several times he walked in complete circles, passing the same terrain features without recognizing them. His tracks, briefly visible between wind gusts, revealed the erratic pattern of someone who had lost control of both body and mind. At one point, Akaya collapsed for the first time. He managed to get back to his feet after several minutes of struggle, but his coordination was severely compromised. His speech had become completely incoherent, and he began removing his outer gloves and hat, feeling overheated despite the life-threatening cold. Eventually, he collapsed again near a crevasse field, not far from the established descent route. This time, he lacked the strength and coordination to rise. His body was succumbing to the extreme conditions, with the cold and wind overwhelming his ability to maintain consciousness. The combination of altitude, exposure, and deteriorating physical condition created a situation that would be fatal even for experienced climbers. Pemba descended safely through the storm, using his experience and knowledge of the route to reach a safe shelter where other climbing parties had taken refuge. He stayed briefly, hoping Akaya might return, but it became clear he would not, and Pemba continued down to the base. Once there, he reported Akaya's last known location and equipment to park authorities. Rescue teams evaluated the situation, but determined that searching during the storm would be too dangerous, so they waited for conditions to improve. Several days later, aerial reconnaissance located Akaya's body near the upper route, slightly off course. A specialized rescue team reached the site to confirm the death. The extreme cold, high winds, and deep snow made the approach challenging, requiring careful coordination to ensure rescuer safety. The official investigation concluded that Akaya died from hypothermia, with exhaustion and dehydration as contributing factors. There was no evidence of trauma, falls, or impairment. His final hours reflected the hazards of high-altitude climbing, particularly in severe weather, and highlighted the critical importance of preparation, caution, and adherence to expert guidance. Even the most careful preparation could not replace respect for the mountain's power. Akaya's death prompted changes in high-altitude climbing practices, with guides refining turnaround times, client screening, and emergency protocols to reduce risk. The incident highlighted the tension between ambition and safety, and his family urged that no blame be placed on those facing impossible decisions in extreme conditions. Today, his body remains on Mount Rainier, a stark reminder that preparation and caution must always come before personal ambition. It was May 19, 2016, at the south col of Mount Everest, where climbers prepared to leave Camp 4 and move on to the upper ridge. Wind cut across the tents and pressed through layered clothing. Headlamps reduced the world to short tunnels of light. Oxygen regulators released a steady hiss that blended into the background noise of the camp. From a distance, the system appeared intact. The fixed lines were in place. The queue was moving, and conditions were still within what the schedule allowed. At this altitude, routine can continue even after a critical failure has already been introduced. Leo Vance was 44 years old, a structural engineer from outside Columbus, Ohio. He worked for a regional firm that designed small bridges, parking structures, and commercial retrofits, spending his days evaluating loads, margins, and failure points. He approached risk as something measurable and controllable when information was accurate. He was not an extreme athlete and avoided improvisation. At his local climbing gym, he was known for following instructions precisely, double-checking knots, and relying on checklists rather than instinct. Over 5 years, he saved for a $32,000 commercial Everest expedition by setting aside bonuses and tax refunds. Leo's father died at 51 from a sudden heart attack, a loss that left Leo convinced his own body carried a clock. He began climbing in his late 30s and treated it as conditioning rather than thrill-seeking, training methodically with weighted stair climbs, long Appalachian hikes, and annual trips to Colorado for snow and ice practice. He approached the sport the way he approached engineering, adding margin, avoiding improvisation, and deferring to established expertise. Choosing a commercial Everest expedition was part of that logic. An experienced guide was meant to be the final safety layer he could not create himself. The south side route of Everest was familiar to him in structure, if not experience. It functioned as a managed corridor of fixed lines, ladders, and staged camps. The Khumbu icefall relied on anchored ladders. The western CWM punished dehydration under heat and thin air. The Lhotse face forced climbers upward on fixed ropes. And above the South Col, the ridge narrowed into exposed terrain where fatigue and wind magnified small errors. His equipment matched a standard commercial summit attempt, nothing unusual and effective only if the system was used by someone who understood it. Leo chose a budget commercial agency because it offered the same summit promise for less money. The savings came from tighter staffing, shared resources, and fewer safeguards behind the scenes. When he arrived at Everest Base Camp on May 14th, after the long Khumbu approach, he was tired but confident in what he believed he had purchased. His contract named Dawa Tenzing as his personal guide, described as a 12-time Everest summiteer. The agency's website showed Dawa as a seasoned Sherpa in his 40s, someone who had already made the hardest decisions on the mountain and survived them. For Leo, that name mattered. It was the justification for choosing a cheaper operator, while still believing the most dangerous calls would be handled by real experience. What Leo did not know was that Dawa was never coming up the mountain. A back injury had kept him in Kathmandu for the entire season, and the agency chose not to say anything. The budget setup left little room for refunds or delays, and losing one client could wipe out profits from several others. High on Everest, where everyone wears masks, goggles, and the same bulky down suits, it is hard to tell who is who. The agency counted on that. Instead of canceling the climb or reassigning clients openly, they quietly swapped the guide after the expedition was already underway. On paper, nothing changed. The same guide name stayed on the contract. In reality, the person meant to handle route choices, weather calls, and life or death decisions was replaced by someone who only looked qualified. Leo never saw a clear warning because the system was built to hide it. By choosing a budget operator, he entered a setup where critical roles could be changed without notice. And the mountain was where that choice was finally tested. The substitute was Pema, a 19-year-old cousin of the agency owner. He was not a certified high-altitude guide. He had never climbed above 8,000 meters and had never been responsible for route decisions, navigation, or client safety in the death zone. To complete the substitution, Pema was given Dawa's old down suit and told to keep his face covered at all times. On Everest, where everyone wears goggles, masks, and identical layers of fabric, the suit became the identity. To anyone behind him on a rope, Pema looked exactly like the guide Leo believed he had hired. From the start, Pema moved carefully and stayed close to senior Sherpas, copying what they did and repeating instructions he had been given. Leo had no reason to suspect that the person in front of him was not who the contract promised. More importantly, he did not want to suspect it. He believed he had paid for expertise, and that belief shaped how he interpreted every warning sign that followed. The early climbs made the problem easy to miss. Fixed ropes showed everyone exactly where to go. Daily routines were predictable, and climbers moved through the same narrow lanes of traffic. At Camp 2, Pema had trouble setting his ascender correctly and had to watch another Sherpa show him how to seat the cam on the rope. On the Lhotse face, his oxygen mask sat loose, letting moisture from his breath freeze around the regulator until airflow dropped. He moved quickly but without a steady rhythm, wasting energy. In a crowded season, those mistakes looked like normal fatigue and altitude stress. Leo read them that way and continued to depend on the person leading him. Everything above base camp was driven by schedule pressure. Weather briefings focused on opportunity and cost. Missing a summit window meant burning extra oxygen, eating through supplies, paying staff for more days, and dealing with refund requests. On May 18th, climbers were told that wind and cloud were expected to build after midday on the 19th, but it was framed as a caution, not a hard cutoff. Leo assumed his guide would recognize when conditions crossed the line and would enforce a turnaround. That assumption was part of the service he believed he had purchased. It let him hand off judgment when thinking clearly was already becoming harder. At Camp 4 on the South Col, comfort disappeared. The air was so thin that simply sitting upright sent heart rate racing. Oxygen systems had to run continuously. Moisture could freeze inside hoses and regulators. Masks could leak if straps shifted even slightly. Bottles had to be swapped while hands shook and vision narrowed. Mistakes that would be harmless lower on the mountain became life-threatening because the body had no reserve left. Leo checked his gear methodically, the way he checked calculations at work, and continued to rely on the guide to manage the terrain and decisions he could no longer safely evaluate himself. They left Camp 4 around 12:30 a.m., stepping into the line that led toward the balcony and the south summit. Leo and Pema were tied close together on a short rope, a low-cost method used to keep clients from drifting or falling behind. The rope ran through a single locking carabiner on Pema's harness before connecting to Leo, with almost no slack between them. Short roping keeps two people close, but it also means they share balance. If one person slips, the force transfers instantly to the other. In extreme cold, metal becomes brittle, and when a sudden load hits a single connection point, weak or poorly rated gear can fail instead of absorbing the force. Safer systems spread that load across multiple anchors. Leo clipped his ascender onto the fixed rope, stepped up, slid it higher, and repeated the same motion over and over. The system appeared stable, which made it easier to keep climbing than to stop and question the person leading him. As the hours passed and morning turned into midday, the mountain slowed everyone down. The line tightened. When one climber stopped, everyone stopped. Long pauses became common. The change was subtle. Judgment began to feel confident, even as thinking slowed. Leo felt numbness creep into his fingers despite thick mitts and stiffness. At this altitude, panic does not always look like fear. It often looks like speed, like someone pushing forward because stopping feels worse. By early afternoon, they were close to the summit. That closeness pulled them higher, even as conditions worsened. Blowing snow flattened the landscape, erasing depth and direction. What had once been a clear ridge shrank to a few visible steps. The fixed rope was harder to find, where it was iced over or buried. Climbers stacked up at narrow sections, forcing long waits followed by short, hurried moves. A turnaround time existed on the plan, but plans only work when someone enforces them. That required a guide who could read terrain, recognize danger through whiteout, and stop upward movement. Pema did not have that skill. He believed his job was to keep Leo moving. Leo believed his job was to trust the guide in front of him. Around 2:15 in the afternoon, less than 100 meters below the summit, a dark cloud slammed into the ridge without warning. The light collapsed into a flat, colorless gray. Wind surged hard enough to shake bodies and tear sound away, drowning out shouted warnings and the scrape of metal on ice. Snow blasted sideways, sticking to goggles and freezing instantly, shrinking the world to a few blurred shapes. Nothing obvious broke. The mountain simply reduced everything until only the next step felt real. The safe response was plain and unglamorous. Stop, wait for the wind to pass, and use a compass or GPS to find the line again. That meant standing still in brutal cold, burning oxygen, slowing everyone behind them, and admitting the summit push was slipping away. Pema chose to move. He edged sideways, feeling for ground that sloped down, assuming it was the descent back toward the South Col. In a whiteout, the shift from narrow ridge to open face is subtle and deadly. Leo could see only the broad orange back in front of him. The wind erased all other sound. The rope behind them was gone under snow. Leo followed because his entire plan rested on one belief. The person leading him knew where they were. By the time that belief mattered, the ground beneath them was no longer the route. During a brief lull, the haze thinned just enough for the climber to raise a helmet camera. The footage later showed two orange figures moving sideways across the slope instead of up the ridge. The clip lasted seconds, but it captured the mistake in motion. Pema stepped onto a stretch of blue ice polished smooth by constant wind. In the flat light, it looked like firm snow. His crampon points skated instead of biting. His feet slid out from under him, and his body pitched downhill. He threw his ice axe down on instinct, but the pick struck at a shallow angle and skipped off the surface. The slip became a fall in an instant. The rope between him and Leo snapped tight like a whip. Leo's foot was planted, his weight committed, but the force hit too fast. There was no time to brace, no time to cut loose. The mountain took both of them at once. They accelerated almost immediately. The surface beneath them was hard, polished ice with patches of bare rock. Their down suits and packs skimmed across it like plastic on glass. Leo drove his ice axe down in a reflex, but the pick struck a rock edge and bounced, sending a violent jolt up his arm. The rope between them snapped tight, then loose, then tight again. The sound was a dull, hollow scraping, mixed with the snap of fabric tearing. They slid roughly 40 meters toward the break in the ridge, where the mountain drops away into the north face. Wind erased depth and direction. What felt like a slope was already a cliff. Pema hit a rock ledge first. The impact twisted his body sideways and smashed the carabiner at his harness directly into stone. The blow knocked the air from him and spun him against the rock, where the ledge slowed him, just enough to stop the slide. Snow packed into his clothing as he was pressed hard against the wall. The rope between them went tight at a sharp angle. All the force ran through a single piece of metal, loaded sideways, exactly how it should never be used. Leo slid past him and over the edge. He did not drop cleanly. He was thrown onto a steep, broken slope of rock and hard ice and began tumbling end over end. His left side struck first, whipping his body around. The down suit ripped open along his hip and thigh as sharp stone shredded the fabric. Feathers burst out in a white cloud and vanished into the wind. The next impact snapped his right leg above the boot, bone punching into muscle. Ribs collapsed and drove into his lungs and heart. There was no pause, no chance to slow. Each hit fed into the next, carrying him faster and farther down. The rock stripped him like coarse sandpaper. As the suit came apart, skin was ground away, down to muscle along his torso and legs. One glove snagged on a projection and wrenched his wrist until it broke. His pack shifted violently, and the waist belt cut deep into his abdomen as the load hammered his spine again and again. His oxygen mask was torn from his face, the hose snapping loose. What remained was a long, uncontrolled slide, broken by repeated brutal impacts, each one adding damage until nothing remained to stop the motion. We break down failures like this all the time, where shortcuts and hidden decisions turn routine climbs into fatal ones. If you want to understand how Everest really works when systems break, consider subscribing. A Swiss climber's helmet camera recorded 12 seconds of it. 2 orange figures slid sideways across the slope. A sharp metallic sound cut through the wind as an ice axe hit stone and was ripped away. Then the frame filled with blowing snow and a fixed rope snapping and shaking under gusts. Farther down the ridge, another team saw brief movement through the fog and knew someone had fallen. They radioed up the line, asking if anyone was missing. Minutes later, a Sherpa descending from above reached Pema, jammed against rock with a loose rope end and broken gear hanging from his harness. He clipped Pema into an anchor, checked him quickly, and reported the situation. The first distress call reached Camp 4 in about 10 minutes, passed hand to hand through climbers who still had working radios and enough oxygen left to speak clearly. No rescue could be sent toward Leo's last known position that day. The north face was lost in whiteout, with winds strong enough to knock climbers sideways. Helicopters could not fly that high in thin air and heavy wind. A ground search would have meant leaving the fixed ropes, crossing unknown terrain, and stepping into a steep fall path filled with blowing snow. That would have put more people at risk. Expedition leaders shifted from rescue to control. Radios were used to confirm who was accounted for on the ridge. Teams above and below the area were told to stop moving when possible. Sherpas closest to the site checked laterally whenever visibility opened, while others descended to pass messages. As the weather held, efforts focused on tracking what had happened rather than moving into the fall zone. Radio calls were logged. Climbers near the area were asked what they saw and when. Camp 4 checked head counts and oxygen use to make sure no one else was missing. The Swiss team handed over helmet camera footage that showed the sideways movement and the slide. Wind erased footprints on the ridge within hours, but Pema's position and broken hardware near a rock ledge marked the point of failure. That same day, staff began reviewing guide lists. It quickly became clear that the guide named in the contract was not on the mountain. By the time conditions eased, word had already spread through base camp. The agency blamed sudden weather and route confusion, but climbers compared details among themselves. Video surfaced of Pema being questioned near the dining tents, unable to read a GPS unit or explain his choices. The focus shifted away from the storm and toward how an unqualified person ended up guiding a client in the death zone. Within days, workers from neighboring camps confirmed his actual role as a kitchen helper with no experience above the lower camps. Word spread quickly. Authorities and regulators demanded documentation from the agency. By the end of the season, the incident was openly discussed at base camp and across climbing forums, not as a freak accident, but as a failure created by a concealed substitution that only became lethal once weather erased the route and judgment mattered most. Leo's death itself remained unresolved for months. 3 months later, a Chinese recovery team working on the north side of the mountain reported human remains surfacing from ice and rock roughly 2,800 meters below the ridge. Seasonal melt and slow ice movement had pushed fragments of torn-down suit, webbing, and oxygen hardware into view. The team approached cautiously on fixed ropes, installing anchors and treating the site as unstable terrain rather than a single recovery point. The body was badly damaged by the fall and prolonged exposure, but identification was confirmed through serial numbers on oxygen components, a sewn name tag inside the suit, and cross-checking with expedition records. Recovery took multiple stages over several days, lowering the remains to a safer altitude for documentation before transfer. The location and condition confirmed what climbers already knew. Leo had not survived the fall, and there had never been a window in which rescue was possible. The post-mortem report stated that Leo died instantly from internal decapitation, caused by extreme bending forces during the first major impact. Although the skin of the neck remained mostly intact, the skull and upper spine were no longer connected inside the body. The report also documented severe blunt force trauma, both femurs shattered into multiple pieces, the pelvis broken, the rib cage collapsed, and fatal injuries to the lungs and heart. Large areas of skin were stripped away where his clothing tore during the slide. These injuries matched the terrain and the video evidence of a long, uncontrolled fall over rock and ice. Cold preserved the body in a curled position where it came to rest. Investigators noted this was a physical effect of freezing, not evidence of awareness after the fatal injury. The investigation focused on the sequence and equipment. Radio logs and witness statements placed the route deviation within minutes of a sudden whiteout that buried the fixed line. Hardware recovered near the rock outcrop showed a fractured carabiner with no visible certification markings and a brake pattern consistent with shock loading in extreme cold. The short rope setup funneled all force through that single connector. Review of the GPS unit seen later at base camp showed it was a basic consumer device, but staff interviews confirmed Pema had not been trained to use it. Agency records revealed that the named guide was not on the mountain and that management knowingly substituted an unqualified worker, a decision investigators described as deliberate misrepresentation driven by cost and refund avoidance. Under pressure, the agency issued partial refunds and provided documents to regulators. Climbing organizations used the case in safety briefings on guide, verification, and rope systems. In Ohio, Leo's engineering firm reviewed his recent projects and found a consistent pattern of overbuilt safety margins, written plainly to account for human error. Within a year, his family formed the Leo Vance Foundation, which funded GPS training, independent credential checks, and third-party verification for commercial expeditions rather than climbs. The case stayed in circulation not because Everest changed, but because it showed how a hidden substitution can survive routine systems and only reveal itself when weather removes every remaining margin. The decision that killed Leo Vance was not made in the death zone. It was made months earlier, on paper, when the mistake could still have been undone. By the time the mountain revealed it, everyone else already knew, and there was no way back. It was April 14th, 2022, 9 days into an acclimatization rotation on the south side of Mount Everest in Nepal's Khumbu region. Base camp sat at approximately 17,600 feet on the Khumbu Glacier, while the mountain above remained, as it always had, unmoved by the people attempting to climb it. Andrei Kowalczyk was 26 years old and from Columbus, Ohio. A few years earlier, she had dropped out of college to focus on content creation full-time. She was usually the more energetic of the two and had a habit of chasing bigger ideas whenever something seemed like it might attract attention. I'll be honest, I can already picture which one of them was usually volunteering for the camera. Her experience in the mountains was fairly limited. The only time she had climbed at a comparable altitude, she developed symptoms of altitude sickness and turned back before reaching the summit. Her friend and business partner, Mayetta Tennyson, was 28 and from Scottsdale, Arizona. Before helping run the channel, she worked in dental hygiene. She handled most of the planning behind the scenes, organizing trips, dealing with sponsors, and managing the practical details that kept their projects moving. People who knew them often described Mayette as the more methodical one, while Andrei was usually the person pushing for the next big idea. By early 2022, they had been making videos together for several years. The channel had a dedicated audience, but it was still relatively small compared to the larger creators in the outdoor and travel space. Growth had started to level off, and like a lot of smaller creators, they were looking for a project that might help them reach more people. Everest seemed like exactly that opportunity. Part of the expedition was funded through a sponsorship agreement, and the plan was to document the climb from start to finish. But once they arrived on the mountain, the videos weren't getting the response they had hoped for. I understand the pressure there. You're on Everest, you've got a sponsor watching, and the numbers are flat. That combination makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. As the days passed, the pressure to come home with something people would actually watch became harder to ignore. By the time the expedition moved deeper into the acclimatization phase, Everest wasn't just a climbing objective anymore. For Andrei and Mayette, it had also become the biggest content project they had ever attempted. Neither woman arrived with substantial mountaineering experience. Mayette had completed a short alpine skills course in Europe 2 years earlier, while Andrei's only significant exposure to high-altitude climbing was an unsuccessful guided ascent that ended after she developed symptoms consistent with altitude sickness. Expedition records also indicated they had not completed several recommended educational materials covering altitude illness, decision-making at elevation, and client safety procedures. The route they planned to follow was the standard south side approach to Everest. From base camp at approximately 17,600 feet, climbers first crossed the Khumbu Icefall, a constantly shifting section of glacier considered one of the mountain's most hazardous areas. I don't care how many times I read about the Khumbu Icefall. The idea of a glacier constantly moving beneath people never really stops sounding intimidating. Beyond it, the route climbed through the western Suwm, up the Lhotse face, and eventually to the South Col before continuing toward the summit. Above roughly 26,000 feet lies the death zone, where oxygen levels are too low for the human body to function normally for extended periods. Commercial expeditions reduce the risk through acclimatization rotations, supplemental oxygen, and strict time management, all designed to limit how long climbers remain at extreme altitude. The higher climbers go on Everest, the less oxygen there is available with every breath. And by the elevations reached during a summit push, even simple things, walking, clipping into ropes, adjusting equipment, can leave people exhausted. At first, the effects can seem pretty ordinary. Headaches, poor sleep, loss of appetite, feeling tired all the time. The problem is that those same symptoms can also be the first signs that something more serious is developing. And on Everest, some altitude illnesses can become life-threatening very quickly. Two of the most dangerous are high-altitude cerebral edema, which affects the brain, and high-altitude pulmonary edema, which affects the lungs. If either one develops, the standard treatment is straightforward. Get the climber lower as quickly as possible and provide supplemental oxygen. The challenge is that nothing on Everest is ever quite that simple. Above 25,000 feet, every rescue takes place in extreme cold, difficult terrain and an environment where even healthy climbers are already operating near their physical limits. I've read plenty of Everest rescue reports over the years, and one thing that always stands out is how difficult it can be just to move someone a relatively short distance. The 2022 climbing season had started relatively normally, but guides were already keeping an eye on several concerns along the route. Earlier ice collapses had forced changes inside the Khumbu icefall, and a warmer than usual winter had left some crevasses wider and a number of snow bridges less reliable than climbers would have preferred. Those issues weren't secrets. They were discussed during pre-season briefings, attended by expedition leaders and guides. Climbers were reminded that conditions on the mountain could change quickly and that safety decisions ultimately rested with the expedition staff responsible for getting everyone up and down the mountain alive. Henri and Mayette joined a commercial Everest expedition alongside several other paying clients and a support team of guides and Sherpa staff. From the beginning, they treated the expedition as both a climb and a filming project, bringing extensive camera equipment and producing content throughout their time at base camp. Their activities quickly generated friction within the group, with complaints arising over filming practices, interference with camp operations, and behavior that other climbers viewed as disruptive. Expedition staff addressed the issues as they occurred, and both women generally responded positively during direct conversations. However, similar incidents continued to emerge in different forms. The pattern became increasingly noticeable as the team progressed into the acclimatization phase of the expedition. During an early rotation through the Khumbu icefall, Henri staged what appeared to be a serious medical emergency while Mayette filmed. Believing a climber was in genuine distress, a Sherpa turned around and descended through technical terrain to assist. Upon reaching the scene, he discovered that the incident had been staged for content. I don't have a clever way to frame that. A Sherpa reversed through the Khumbu icefall, one of the most dangerous sections of terrain on that mountain, because he thought someone was dying. The event drew criticism from members of the expedition, who viewed it as an inappropriate use of resources in an environment where genuine emergencies were common and response time could be critical. The Sherpa who responded wasn't new to Everest. He had many seasons on the mountain and had dealt with real emergencies before. He reported the incident that same day, and it was formally documented. Henri and Mayette received another warning, but no further action was taken. The video was later uploaded from base camp and ended up performing slightly better than their recent expedition content. In the days that followed, more incidents continued to strain relations within the team. One involved a prank device placed near the Sherpa sleeping area, startling several staff members during an evening rest period. Another involved a social media post filmed near the expedition's oxygen storage area that suggested critical equipment might be unsafe. The post caused concern among family members following the expedition from home and was removed only after expedition leadership intervened. By the time the next scheduled rest day arrived at base camp, the relationship between the two content creators and much of the support staff had become increasingly tense. While the expedition continued to move forward, patience within the team was beginning to wear thin. Later that morning, Henri and Mayette left base camp carrying camera equipment and a length of rope. A short distance from the main approach path, they located a crevasse away from the active climbing route and filmed a staged rescue scenario. Henri partially lowered herself into the opening, while Mayette recorded footage designed to make the situation appear more serious than it was. When filming concluded, Mayette hurried back toward camp and reported that Henri had slipped into a crevasse while scouting for footage. Several Sherpas and expedition staff immediately left camp to investigate, expecting they might be dealing with a genuine accident. When they reached the location, they found Henri standing safely near the edge of the crevasse, while Mayette continued filming. She was standing safely beside the crevasse, holding the same camera that had been recording the entire scenario. I'll be honest, if I'd been part of that rescue team, I don't think I'd have known what to say at that point. Although the incident ended without injury, several staff members viewed it as a serious misuse of their time and attention. In an environment where real emergencies could develop without warning, the incident became the breaking point. Later that day, the expedition's Sherpa staff met with leadership and unanimously decided they would no longer accept responsibility for the pair's safety anywhere above base camp. The decision was not described as emotional or confrontational. Instead, accounts characterized it as a collective conclusion reached after a series of incidents that had repeatedly consumed time, resources, and trust. Without Sherpa support, continuing the expedition was no longer a practical option. Expedition leadership informed the women that their climb was effectively over and offered arrangements for their departure from the mountain. Faced with that outcome, Mayette contacted their sponsor. Although their sponsor was informed about the incidents and the breakdown of the expedition relationship, support was not immediately withdrawn. Henri and Mayette instead began searching for another operator willing to take them. After financial negotiations and a formal apology to the Sherpa leadership, arrangements were made for them to continue the season with a different expedition. The apology was accepted professionally, but it did not change the original team's decision. Finding another operator proved difficult. Several teams declined to take them after learning about the situation at base camp. Eventually, a smaller commercial expedition agreed to accept them, though only after additional discussions with leadership and assurances that future incidents would not be tolerated. Their next acclimatization rotation proceeded without notable problems. During this period, one of their videos from the mountain attracted a far larger audience than anything they had posted previously. The success at that specific moment is what makes the rest of this so hard to sit with. The success relieved immediate concerns about sponsorship obligations and reinforced the value of reaching the upper mountain. By that stage, the expedition had become both a climbing objective and a major professional opportunity. When the favorable weather window arrived, the team began its summit push. The climb through the Lhotse face was slow and physically demanding, but both women reached Camp 3 at approximately 24,500 feet while using supplemental oxygen as planned. Mayet moved steadily with the group, while Henri required more frequent breaks during the ascent. Shortly after arriving, updated forecasts indicated the weather window was deteriorating earlier than expected. In response, expedition leadership shortened the schedule and decided to move toward Camp 4 that same evening, rather than after a full night's rest. During that rest period, several members of the expedition later recalled seeing Henri remove her supplemental oxygen mask on multiple occasions while filming and reviewing camera footage. At 24,500 feet, every breath without that mask is doing something to your brain, whether you feel it or not. She was also dealing with a persistent headache that had developed during the climb up the Lhotse face. At that altitude, headaches aren't unusual, and it's possible she viewed it as just another part of the climb. Hoping to manage the symptoms, she took more acclimatization medication than prescribed. Neither the headache nor the extra medication was reported to her guide or assigned Sherpa. The team left Camp 3 that evening under conditions that were difficult but still considered manageable for a summit push. Visibility was limited, strong winds were already affecting the route, and temperatures remained far below zero, leaving little margin for any further change in the weather. The climb toward Camp 4 followed fixed ropes across the upper Lhotse face and onto higher terrain, leading toward the South Col. Henri was positioned near the front of the client group, with her assigned Sherpa directly behind her, while Mayet climbed farther ahead. The arrangement allowed guides to monitor both women while maintaining the team's normal climbing order. Less than an hour after departure, conditions deteriorated more quickly than expected. Winds strengthened significantly, visibility fell to only a few dozen feet at times, and communication became increasingly difficult. Climbers remained attached to the fixed line and continued upward, moving slowly through the worsening weather as the mountain grew less forgiving with each passing hour. Roughly 90 minutes above Camp 3, the lead guide ordered a mandatory stop so the team could secure themselves to a fixed anchor and reassess conditions. The procedure was routine and intended to evaluate weather, equipment, and the condition of the climbers before continuing higher. When Henri didn't arrive with the rest of the group, her assigned Sherpa went back down the route to find her. He eventually spotted her some distance behind the others, standing off to the side of the main climbing line and filming. I don't know what was going through her head at that moment, but she was still filming, in the dark, in a storm, separated from her team on the Lhotse face. At that point, she was still responsive and didn't appear to be in immediate danger. The Sherpa guided her back to the group, the team completed its assessment, and the climb continued. Given where they were on the mountain and the conditions around them, moving toward Camp 4 was still considered safer than turning everyone around and descending in the dark. But as the night went on, the weather kept getting worse. The wind came in powerful bursts, sometimes strong enough to stop climbers in their tracks and force them to brace against the slope. Visibility continued to shrink, and talking to one another became increasingly difficult beneath the constant noise of the storm. Most climbers were focused on one thing: staying attached to the fixed rope and continuing upward. Then, during one of the strongest gusts of the night, the line of climbers became separated from one another. When the team tried to confirm everyone's position, Henri was nowhere to be seen. And that's the kind of environment where people can disappear from view surprisingly fast. During a burst of wind-driven snow, Henri's assigned Sherpa lost sight of her for several minutes. When visibility improved, the fixed line ahead was occupied by other climbers, but Henri was no longer where he expected her to be. Investigators later concluded that the exact circumstances of her separation from the route could not be determined. Mayette, climbing farther ahead, noticed that her partner had disappeared from view. Because Henri had repeatedly stopped throughout the expedition to film the conditions around her, Mayette initially assumed she had paused again for footage. That assumption delayed an immediate radio call. I've thought about that delay more than once while going through this. She made a completely reasonable assumption based on a pattern she had watched for weeks, and it cost minutes they didn't have. Investigators later estimated the delay at several minutes based on GPS tracking data carried by the lead guide. When Mayette finally reported the situation, she described it as uncertain and could not confirm whether Henri was filming or in trouble. The guide ordered a full stop and conducted a radio head count, but Henri did not respond. Her last confirmed GPS signal placed her below the team's position and some distance away from the primary fixed route. The lead guide and the team's most experienced Sherpa immediately descended toward Henri's last known location. By then, conditions had become extreme. Winds were strong enough to make movement difficult, temperatures were far below zero, and any interruption in oxygen delivery or prolonged exposure could quickly become life-threatening. Henri was located less than half an hour later, below the main route and partially sheltered by terrain. She was alive but visibly impaired. Her oxygen system was functioning, but her mask had shifted enough to reduce the effectiveness of the supplemental oxygen she was receiving. She was responsive, though confused and unable to communicate clearly. Based on her condition and a radio consultation with the expedition physician at base camp, rescuers believed she was experiencing a combination of significant cold stress and oxygen deprivation, affecting her neurological function. The guide and Sherpa immediately began an assisted descent toward Camp 3rd while maintaining oxygen support. Progress was slow and physically demanding, made even more difficult by the altitude and weather. Another Sherpa was dispatched uphill to help, creating a 3-person rescue team operating in some of the harshest conditions on the mountain. Meanwhile, Mayette kept climbing toward Campfish with the rest of the team, following the guide's instructions. After reaching the South Col, she got a radio update. Henri had been found, but her condition was serious, and a rescue was already underway. The message was clear: stay at camp and wait for further information. But Mayette didn't stay put. I'll be honest, I understand the impulse completely, and I also think it was the wrong call the moment she acted on it. As soon as she heard how bad things were, she decided to head back down toward the rescue effort. Another client went with her. On a personal level, the decision made sense. Her friend was in trouble, and she wanted to help. The problem was where she was making that decision. It was dark, the wind was still hammering the mountain, and visibility was poor. They were moving through some of the most dangerous terrain on Everest after spending hours climbing at extreme altitude, where exhaustion can make it harder to recognize when your judgment is starting to slip. Partway down the route, they came across a fixed-line obstruction left by another team. Situations like that aren't unusual on Everest, but getting around them often means carefully repositioning yourself around the anchor system. As Mayette worked her way through the obstruction, a powerful gust slammed into the slope. She lost her footing and suddenly started sliding down the face. She was eventually able to stop the fall, but not before traveling a significant distance down the mountain. The impact left her with a serious leg injury that prevented her from standing or moving independently. Now at roughly the same elevation, where Henri was already being evacuated, Mayette was stranded on the mountain in extreme weather with no practical ability to descend on her own. The Sherpa climbed upward to assist with Henri's rescue and located Mayette several hours later. After assessing her condition, he radioed base camp with a new problem. There were now 2 incapacitated clients on the Lhotse face, separated by distance during a storm that continued to intensify. If I'm the person receiving that radio call, that's about as bad a situation as I can imagine hearing about. A helicopter evacuation was requested from base camp as the situation worsened, but weather conditions above the lower camps made any immediate flight operation impossible. The request remained active, yet no safe weather window developed in time to affect the outcome. After a difficult overnight evacuation, rescuers finally got Henri back down to Camp 3. They kept her on oxygen, worked to warm her up, and did everything they could with the resources available at that altitude. But her condition kept getting worse. She never really became aware of what was happening around her again. Then, in the early morning hours, she was pronounced dead. Later findings concluded that she had suffered severe altitude-related swelling of the brain, with hypothermia making an already critical situation even worse. Higher up on the mountain, the situation with Mayette was still unfolding. Rescue teams were continuing their efforts to reach her and bring her down, but nothing about the operation was easy. She was injured, she was stranded at extreme altitude, and the weather still hadn't stabilized. As rescuers worked their way down the mountain, conditions began deteriorating again. Progress slowed, options became more limited, and the window to get Mayette off the mountain safely was getting smaller by the hour. Mayette was later found unresponsive on the mountain. Efforts to revive her were unsuccessful. Subsequent findings identified a combination of altitude-related illness, traumatic injury sustained during her fall, and prolonged exposure during the rescue delay as the factors contributing to her death. Neither woman reached the summit. Both died on the same mountain they had traveled across the world to document. News of the fatalities spread quickly through Everest's guiding community. Several members of the original Sherpa team who had refused to continue climbing with the pair learned of the outcome through seasonal radio traffic and inter-expedition communications. The subsequent investigation did not identify a single cause. Instead, investigators described a chain of contributing factors that reinforced one another: limited high-altitude experience, repeated disregard for expedition safety practices, delays in recognizing the seriousness of the emergency, and weather that deteriorated more quickly than expected. Individually, none guaranteed a fatal outcome. Combined, they steadily reduced the margin for recovery. That is the part of cases like this I keep coming back to. There's rarely one moment where it all goes wrong. It's usually a sequence of smaller things, each one narrowing the window a little further. Medical findings concluded that Henri died from severe altitude-related swelling of the brain, compounded by hypothermia after becoming separated from the team with compromised oxygen delivery. Mayette's death was attributed to a combination of altitude-related fluid accumulation in the lungs, injuries sustained during her fall, and prolonged exposure while rescue efforts were underway. In both cases, investigators noted that an earlier descent under controlled conditions represented the intervention most likely to have changed the outcome. The sponsorship agreement ended shortly afterward, and the channel ceased activity. It was May 9, 2019. Morning traffic moved steadily around Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu, Nepal, as international arrivals from overnight flights filtered through under clear spring conditions. I'm watching people drag duffel bags across the curbside lane like it's just another business trip, not the last normal sidewalk they'll see for weeks. Laura Jean Braley was 52. She was about 5'8", and she always wore this GPS fitness watch she'd been using for years. Like, she tracked everything on it, every hike, every training session, all of that. It actually ended up being important later on. She'd flown in from Houston with a layover in Doha, and this wasn't some quick decision either. She'd been planning the whole Everest trip for about 2 years. She grew up in Beaumont, Texas, in a pretty modest working-class family, nothing fancy. Later on, she went to a public university in Texas on a partial scholarship, studied business logistics, and then kind of built her whole career from there, the Gulf Coast energy and shipping world. By 2019, she was pretty high up, vice president of operations at a mid-sized logistics company around Houston. She was basically running supply chain coordination across 3 Gulf Coast states, managing a team of about 40 people. 40 people under one chain of command feels stable until you compare it to environments where nothing actually reports back cleanly. People who worked with her described her as very strict, very detail-focused, very numbers-driven. The kind of person who liked control and structure in everything she did. Now, she wasn't new to mountains either, but she also wasn't some elite climber. She'd done a few tough Colorado 14ers, hiked the Inca Trail back in 2014, and even went on a guided Aconcagua expedition in 2017. That one got her up to around 22,000 feet before they had to turn back because of the weather, so she had experience. but still very much in the guided expedition category. For Everest, she went with a standard commercial operator that already included Sherpa support as part of the expedition structure. However, she chose not to purchase an additional one-on-one support package that would have paired her more closely with a dedicated high-altitude Sherpa during the upper mountain stages. As for why she went at all, she always kept it pretty simple when people asked. It was just framed as ambition, a personal challenge, that kind of thing. She didn't really talk about doubts or deeper meaning publicly. In fact, she'd even brought it up a couple of years earlier during a company meeting about resilience, basically using her training in climbing as an example of discipline and pushing limits. So for people around her, it kind of fit that image she already had: structured, driven, always chasing difficult goals. Her divorce from a civil engineer in Houston was finalized in late 2017 after 19 years of marriage. In the years that followed, her life became increasingly structured around fitness, work, and progressively more demanding climbing goals. She maintained regular medical checkups, worked with a trainer, and consulted a nutritionist for high-altitude preparation. She arrived in Kathmandu fit, financially prepared, and convinced she was ready. The 2019 Everest season was marked by unusually heavy traffic on the standard routes during the primary summit window in late May, when multiple teams were compressed into a narrow weather opening. This created severe congestion on the fixed rope sections above extreme altitude, where movement slowed to a crawl and delays became unavoidable on summit days rather than evenly across the season. Personally, I don't like the idea of multiple teams getting forced into the same narrow rope lines at the same hour. It turns movement into waiting in place. Lorridge and Brayley showed up that season, planning to climb the South Col route, the usual commercial path on the Nepal side of Everest. It's the standard route most guided expeditions use. You start through the Khumbu Icefall, then move up into the western CWM toward Camp 2, and from there it gets steeper as you go up the Lhotse face to Camp 3. After that comes the South Col, which sits way up at extreme altitude before the final push to the summit. Above Camp 2, conditions also become significantly more demanding. The terrain transitions into steep, sustained ice slopes, where climbers rely entirely on fixed ropes and ascenders, and even basic movement requires constant effort due to reduced oxygen levels. Weather exposure at these elevations can change quickly, and cold wind and limited visibility all combine to increase physical strain and reduce reaction time. So basically, that's what the upper mountain is like. Things slow way down. Mistakes don't really have much room to happen. And as you go higher, you just get more and more worn out, both physically and mentally. And Lorrigan knew all of that going in. Not just in theory, but she'd actually prepared for it, trained for it, planned around it. And even knowing how harsh it could get up there, she still chose to go ahead with the climb. The expedition group assembled over 3 days in a guest house in Kathmandu's Tamil district between May 9th and May 12th. Lorridge and Brayley's team consisted of 11 climbers, 5 Americans, including herself, 2 British nationals, 2 Australians, and 2 South Koreans. The group was supported by a lead Nepali guide with multiple Everest summits and 4 Sherpas assigned for shared route work, load carrying, and high-altitude support. During the May 11th orientation, expedition staff provided a formal briefing on equipment checks, oxygen protocols, acclimatization scheduling, and available support tiers on the upper mountain. In addition to the standard Sherpa support already included in the expedition, clients were offered an enhanced one-on-one support option that provided closer pacing assistance, more frequent position checks, and direct route supervision during the upper mountain stages. Lorridge and Brayley declined the enhanced one-on-one support option. During this briefing, I catch the speed of that answer. No hesitation, no back and forth, just a clean cut through the explanation. The decision was recorded in expedition documentation and carried forward into final logistics planning without revision. 2 other climbers in the group elected to add the enhanced one-on-one support arrangement. Following the same briefing, the expedition record classified Brayley as remaining within the standard group-supported structure, relying on the expedition's shared Sherpa coverage, fixed rope infrastructure, and scheduled team movement rather than additional individualized supervision on the upper mountain. This distinction later became relevant in assessments of her independent movement decisions on the upper mountain. The trek from Lukla to Everest Base Camp took roughly 6 days through the Khumbu Valley and proceeded without incident for Lorridge and Brayley. She moved efficiently through the standard acclimatization stops, Namche Bazaar, Tengboche, Dingboche, and Labouche, often arriving ahead of much of her group and showing no visible signs of fatigue. I'm looking at that bottle position on her pack in my head and noticing how little it's actually being touched between stops. The gradual ascent from about 9,000 feet to 17,600 feet appeared to confirm her confidence in her physical conditioning. Expedition staff later noted that performance on the trek is not a reliable indicator of how a climber will function above roughly 22,000 feet. That is generally the point where conditions shift significantly, oxygen availability drops further, and the physiological strain increases steadily the longer a person remains at altitude. They also made it clear in the briefing materials everyone gets before the climb, just so clients don't assume the approach hike means they're fully ready for what comes higher up. Lorigen reached base camp on May 18th, where she organized her gear with routine efficiency and communicated to her family via satellite message that she felt strong. On Everest, the standard acclimatizations process involves going up to higher camps and then coming back down again, repeating that cycle so the body can adjust to the low oxygen. These rotations matter because the body only properly adapts during recovery at lower elevations, when things like red blood cell production and other responses can stabilize. If you skip steps or compress the schedule, it doesn't make you adapt faster. It usually just increases the risk of incomplete acclimatization and altitude-related illness. During the first rotation from May 19th to May 25th, the group moved through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 and returned to base camp. Lorigen Braley completed the rotation without incident and maintained a strong pace, though a Sherpa noted she was hydrating less than recommended. The issue was raised during the briefing, but her intake did not change in any measurable way. That hydration detail kind of sticks with me, because it's one of those things people are usually told and then just don't really change. The second rotation from May 26th to June 1st took the team to Camp 2 at approximately 21,300 feet. Lorigen left a day early on the return, despite the guide's recommendation to complete the full schedule, marking the first clear deviation from the expedition plan. During subsequent rest at base camp, she reviewed oxygen usage independently and considered reducing flow rates above Camp 3 to extend supply, a decision that would have reduced oxygen below standard safety thresholds established for performance at extreme altitude. Another climber did not adopt the suggestion. A weather window was projected for late May into early June, and expedition leaders coordinated schedules across multiple teams to align with the remaining viable summit conditions. The group's plan was to leave base camp in early June, move to Camp 2, then continue to Camp 3 before staging for the summit push, after the peak congestion period had already passed. So during planning, Lorigen kind of pushed the idea that they could move a bit faster, just to make better use of the weather window they were expecting. But the lead guy didn't go for it. He basically said the schedule was already set up carefully for acclimatization and safety, and that staging night at Camp 3 wasn't something they could really skip. I hear how final that response is, and it doesn't feel like something you can keep negotiating after it's said. It just closes the space in the room. Lorigen said she understood that in the moment, and she went along with it in the meeting. But later on, she didn't really change her own thinking about it. When a forecast update on June 6th suggested a possible earlier deterioration at the tail end of the window, the guide advised maintaining the existing plan, emphasizing that the main climbing days remained viable and that accelerating movement would increase physiological risk. Most climbers agreed to hold the schedule. Lorigen interpreted the update differently and began adjusting her personal plan in private, calculating that an earlier departure from Camp 3 could help her avoid upper mountain congestion on the fixed lines. Her reasoning correctly identified the bottleneck risk present in 2019 conditions, but the adjustment introduced timing and exposure risks that were not fully accounted for within the expedition's coordinated structure. The group moved from base camp through the Khumbu Icefall and into the western CWM on June 7th to June 8th as scheduled. Traffic in the icefall was heavier than during acclimatization rotations due to the convergence of multiple teams ahead of the weather window. Lorigen Braley moved quickly through congested sections, and at 2 points, advanced past other climbers in ways the lead Sherpa later described as outside standard icefall protocol, increasing spacing pressure on the rope teams behind her. She reached Camp 2 ahead of the main group. That kind of passing in those narrow icefall sections changes how everything behind it has to space out, and I can't really ignore how quickly that ripple effect happens. That night at 21,300 feet, where oxygen levels are roughly half of sea level, most climbers experience disrupted sleep due to periodic breathing. Lorigan reported sleeping well, a notable contrast to typical responses at that altitude. On June 9th, the team ascended the Lhotse face to Camp 3 at approximately 24,500 feet. The climb, conducted on fixed ropes at steep angles in sub-freezing conditions, took Lorigan just over 5 hours, again ahead of most of her group. At this elevation, supplemental oxygen does not eliminate hypoxic stress, and cognitive performance is measurably reduced even in experienced climbers. That evening, the lead guide confirmed the plan for a staged move from Camp 3 to Camp 4 the following night, followed by a midnight summit push. Lorigan acknowledged the schedule during the briefing. However, she had already begun planning an earlier departure from Camp 3, aiming to move ahead of the group to avoid anticipated congestion on the upper route. So sometime between around 11 p.m. and midnight on June 9th, Lorigan just left her tent at Camp 3. I stop at that moment because I can almost see the headlamp clicking on inside the tent before she even fully steps out. She didn't tell the lead guide, didn't check in with any of the Sherpas. She just went. She had her full oxygen setup, her pack, and her satellite communicator with her, and her GPS watch was still running. From what they could tell later, based on her tracking data and timing, she was basically trying to get moving early toward the South Col, probably to avoid that bottleneck when everyone else would start heading up together. And at that altitude, around 24,500 feet on the Lhotse face, it's already a serious environment, even in normal conditions. At night, it gets even tougher. You're climbing by headlamp on fixed ropes over steep blue ice. Visibility drops a lot, and everything just feels tighter and more exposed with the wind shifting around. Even simple stuff like clipping into a rope or using a Jumar isn't simple anymore. You've got to slow everything down, be really deliberate, because your thinking and coordination are already being affected by the altitude. By this point, I find myself thinking about how much mental effort it takes just to complete movements that would normally be automatic. By leaving alone, she removed the group structure that normally provides oversight, confirmation of route, and real-time correction of small errors. The decision was consistent with her earlier pattern of prioritizing efficiency and speed, but it placed her outside the expedition's coordinated system at the most technically and physiologically demanding a section of the route. The Lhotse face above Camp 3 during the night of June 9th into June 10th, 2019 presented materially different conditions than it had in daylight during Lorigan Braley's earlier ascent. While the terrain itself remained the same steep blue ice slope, the operational environment was not. Multiple commercial expeditions operate simultaneously on the South Col route, creating a network of fixed ropes installed by different teams. In some sections between Camp 3 and Camp 4, more than one line may remain anchored on the mountain, including older or secondary ropes that are no longer part of the intended ascent corridor. In daylight, with other climbers nearby and recent familiarity with the route, these distinctions are generally manageable. At night, however, those reference points become much harder to maintain. During the early hours of June 10th, intermittent spindrift reduced visibility to only a few dozen feet at times, while winds gusted to roughly 40 miles per hour. Under those conditions, climbers often rely on rope tension, the direction of travel, and memory of the route rather than continuous visual confirmation of the entire rope system. From a climber's perspective, movement can still feel correct even when a small navigation error has already occurred. I keep thinking about how, in that kind of wind, you're only really working with whatever is directly in front of your hands on the rope. Lorigan had previously ascended this section twice in daylight as part of a group. On this occasion, she was alone in darkness and continuing upward without the immediate support of the Sherpas and climbers scheduled to move with her later that night. At some point in the pre-dawn hours of June 10th, Lorigan Braley moved off the primary fixed line. The exact mechanism of that transition was never conclusively established. However, post-season analysis combined three independent sources of physical evidence: boot track impressions preserved in wind-sheltered ice pockets, her final GPS transmitted positions, and the recovery location recorded later by the Sherpa retrieval team. Taken together, they supported a probable reconstruction rather than a definitive timeline. Investigators concluded she had likely transitioned onto a fixed rope that gradually diverged from the primary South Col ascent corridor by several dozen feet before continuing upward alone. The rope remained anchored and functional, but was not part of the intended ascent line. From that close-up point of view, rope systems don't really stand out as different lines. You're just seeing what's right in front of you, not the bigger picture. If it were me, I'd probably rely on whatever rope was under tension rather than trying to distinguish one system from another in that moment. And when you're climbing, it all feels like forward movement anyway. The rope is tight, your Jumar is catching, your crampons are biting into the ice, you're going up. Nothing in that moment really tells you you're on the wrong line. Subsequent reconstruction relied on intermittent GPS waypoints, boot track impressions preserved in sheltered sections of ice, and the final recovery location, rather than a continuous movement record. Because of battery limitations, signal degradations, and irregular logging intervals at extreme altitude, investigators could not determine the exact moment she transitioned away from the primary route. Instead, they concluded that she had likely continued ascending along a less used fixed line for some time before her pace gradually slowed and eventually stopped altogether. Her oxygen system, when they found it later, still had some oxygen left in it. The recovery team noted the valve setting, but they couldn't really figure out exactly how it had been adjusted during the climb just from looking at the gear. I don't get much clarity from gear like this after the fact. I end up thinking more about how many small adjustments never leave any visible trace. So in the end, it was never clear whether she had actually lowered the oxygen flow earlier on or not. That part just stayed uncertain. No other climbers were within visual or audible range at the time her movement stopped. The rest of her expedition group remained at Camp 3, still hours away from their scheduled departure for Camp 4. She had not informed the guide team, Sherpas, or fellow climbers of her departure, leaving no one aware of her position during the final hours of her ascent. Her satellite communicator contained no emergency transmissions, distress signals, or outbound location requests during this final movement window. At approximately 6:30 a.m. on June 10th, the lead guides team left Camp 3 for Camp 4 on the planned summit rotation. Winds had increased overnight, and conditions on the Lhotse face were difficult, but still within the operational envelope the expedition had been working in. When the team passed Lorigen Braley's tent and saw it empty, a few of them just assumed she had already gone on ahead. That kind of made sense to them at the time, especially because she had been moving fast on earlier rotations and often did her own thing at altitude. I don't really question that assumption at the time. An empty tent up there doesn't automatically mean something is wrong when someone already has a pattern of moving independently. But once the group got all the way up to Camp 4 and still hadn't seen her on the route, that's when the lead guide officially called it and marked her as missing. He started checking in with other teams in base camp over the radio. By then, though, conditions above Camp 3 had already gotten worse. A search at that point would have meant sending people into really risky terrain and weather, so it wasn't something they could safely do right away. No active search was conducted on June 10th. Subsequent recovery efforts were deferred until conditions improved. The opportunity for intervention had already passed on a timeline that was no longer aligned with ground-level decision-making. Lorigen Braley's body was located on June 12, 2019, after a brief weather window allowed a Sherpa recovery team to ascend above Camp 3. She was found at approximately 25,100 feet on the Lhotse face, about 90 feet, laterally offset from the primary South Col fixed line, in a seated position against the slope. Her harness was still clipped into a fixed rope anchor belonging to an older, non-primary line installed in a previous season. Her pack and primary gear were intact and undisturbed. There were no external injuries consistent with a fall or avalanche, and no evidence of a high-impact event. Her satellite communicator contained no outgoing distress transmissions, which investigators assessed as consistent with advanced neurological impairment associated with high-altitude cerebral edema before loss of function. A post-mortem examination, conducted in coordination with Nepali authorities and reviewed by an independent wilderness medicine consultant, identified the primary cause of death as high-altitude cerebral edema. resulting from prolonged hypoxic exposure at extreme altitude. Contributing medical findings included cerebral swelling, consistent with advanced haze, peripheral frostbite injuries to the extremities, dehydration, consistent with reduced fluid intake over the preceding 48 hours, and physiological exhaustion from sustained exertion at altitude. No traumatic injuries were identified. The official determination classified the death as natural causes occurring in an extreme altitude environment. An internal review by the expedition operator, summarized for the Himalayan database and her family's legal representative, identified contributing operational factors, including unilateral departure from Camp 3 outside the planned schedule, independent movement outside the expedition's normal Sherpa-supported climbing structure during the final ascent segment, nighttime movement in deteriorating weather without coordinated group support, and uncertain adherence to standard oxygen flow protocols. No formal negligence was assigned to the operator, and no litigation followed. Laura-Jean Braley's name does not appear in summit records for the 2019 season, as she did not reach the top. Her family declined public comment or media engagement following the incident. It was May 4th, 2016. Base camp at 17,600 feet in the Khumbu region was in a holding pattern as commercial expeditions finalized logistics, rest cycles, and summit plans ahead of the incoming weather window. Derek Allen Pruitt was a 41-year-old civil structural engineer from Houston who balanced a career in commercial construction with endurance sports, including marathons, Ironman triathlons, and a prior guided ascent of Denali. He had invested heavily in this Everest expedition, paying $68,000 through a Kathmandu-based outfitter for a full logistics package and a dedicated Sherpa arrangement. His assigned high-altitude support was Pemba Dorje Tamang, a 38-year-old Sherpa from Solikhumbu with 11 Everest summits and extensive experience working with commercial clients on the mountain. Derek's relationship with his assigned Sherpa, Pemba Dorje Tamang, had become strained during the expedition. Derek believed experienced climbers often relied too heavily on guides, and before leaving Houston, he had written publicly about wanting his Everest summit to feel earned rather than managed. Pemba, meanwhile, approached the climb the way veteran Sherpas typically did, not simply as physical support, but as someone responsible for monitoring a client's condition, judgment, and behavior at extreme altitude. Derek's previous Denali ascent had reinforced his confidence in his own decision-making, and by early May 2016, he felt prepared for Everest. After completing 2 acclimatization rotations to Camp 3 at 24,500 feet, he spent May 4th preparing for the summit push, expected within the next 3 days. During a final gear check at base camp, he and Pemba disagreed over supplemental oxygen strategy. Derek wanted to conserve oxygen by using lower flow rates than the outfitter's standard protocol. He planned to use 1 liter per minute while resting above Camp 3 and 2 liters per minute while climbing, believing it would reduce dependence on supplemental oxygen and extend his supply. The outfitter's standard system called for significantly higher flow rates, especially during the summit push, because above 24,000 feet, supplemental oxygen becomes critical to maintaining physical and mental function. Pemba advised sticking with the standard oxygen settings based on what he'd learned from 11 Everest summits. Derek felt the recommendation was overly cautious and believed it had more to do with liability than with how he was actually performing. The conversation stayed calm, but neither of them changed their position. Later that day, Derek went to the base camp manager and said he wanted to end his dedicated arrangement with Pemba. From that point on, he would rely on the team's rotating Sherpa system instead of working one-on-one support. Pemba accepted the decision without argument and returned to his tent. It didn't really look like much in the moment, but that was the point where the dynamic between them basically stopped being recoverable. What Derek removed, though, was the one person on the mountain who had spent weeks learning how he moved, breathed, reacted to altitude, and showed signs of fatigue, details that become increasingly important higher on Everest, where small changes in judgment or condition are often the first indicators that something is beginning to go wrong. May 5th was scheduled as a rest day before the summit push. Climbers at base camp spent the day eating, hydrating, checking equipment, and conserving energy while waiting for the weather window to open. Derek wrote a short blog post describing base camp life and briefly mentioned the change in support structure, saying he felt strong and ready for the climb ahead. After dismissing his dedicated Sherpa, Derek was reassigned to a rotating support system under Nima Gyeljen, a 29-year-old Sherpa with prior Everest experience but no history as a primary one-on-one summit support guide. Unlike Pemba, Nima would be responsible for multiple clients during the ascent, dividing his attention across the group. That night, Derek's cough worsened. He didn't think much of it at the time. Most people don't up there. In a private journal entry, he noted that it had become more productive, bringing up small amounts of mucus rather than remaining dry, like the common kumbu cough many climbers develop at altitude. He assumed it was caused by the cold, dry air and took ibuprofen before trying to sleep. Early symptoms of high-altitude pulmonary edema can closely resemble ordinary altitude coughs, especially in the beginning stages. Derek understood the condition academically from his research, but he did not interpret his own symptoms as a warning sign. He fell asleep shortly after midnight. In the early hours of May 6th, the summit push began with the team crossing the Khumbu icefall during the coldest period of the night, when the unstable glacier was considered least likely to collapse. Derek moved through the icefall slower than expected, gradually falling behind the group's lead climbers. The delay was not initially considered serious, though several small problems added time during the ascent, including a dead headlamp battery that forced him to switch to a backup light. Nima stayed near him for much of the climb, while also helping manage another client in the rotation. Derek reached Camp 1 at 19,900 feet, nearly an hour behind the front of the group. He described the climb as physically heavy but manageable and believed the terrain higher on the mountain would suit him better. The stretch to Camp 2 at 21,300 feet was where other climbers started noticing things weren't quite right. Derek was stopping a lot during the traverse across the western CWM and moving way slower than the rest of the group had planned for. At one point, Nima even offered to take some weight off his pack, but Derek turned it down. You see that kind of refusal a lot on Everest. People don't want to feel like they're falling behind, even when they clearly are. He finally made it into Camp 2 late in the day, pretty wiped out, but still set on pushing forward. That's usually where things start slipping without anyone really calling it out directly. That evening, Derek barely ate and his cough worsened further, producing more mucus instead of remaining dry. Appetite loss and coughing were common at altitude, and Derek treated both as normal effects of the climb. He did not report the worsening symptoms to Nima or the lead guide before going to sleep. May 7th brought the weather window confirmation. The forecasting services had held. Surface winds at Camp 4 were dropping on schedule, and the window for a summit push was opening. The group would push from Camp 2 to Camp 3, a gain of approximately 3,200 feet up the Lhotse face, a vast, exposed slope of blue ice and fixed rope, and then continue overnight toward Camp 4 and the summit. Above 23,000 feet, the human body enters a physiological range for which it was not designed to remain. Every system is working harder and accomplishing less. Cognition slows. Coordination degrades. The body's ability to sense and respond to pain and cold diminishes in ways that are neurological rather than volitional. The climber is not choosing to feel less. The brain is simply no longer reliably processing the signals. Supplemental oxygen helps, and acclimatization helps too, but only to a point. Nothing really fully fixes what happens up there. That's why it's called the death zone, and why all those careful calculations made lower on the mountain about oxygen, pace, and safety margins have to be right from the start. Above 23,000 feet, Derek's pace dropped to roughly half that of the other clients. While climbing the steep ice of the Lhotse face, he needed increasingly long rest periods between movements and frequently fell behind the group. Because Nema was also assisting another struggling client, Derek spent long stretches effectively climbing alone on the fixed ropes. At approximately 23,800 feet, Derek vomited while attached to the safety line. He rested for several minutes, drank water, and continued upward. Nausea at extreme altitude was not uncommon by itself, but combined with his worsening cough, slowing pace, and growing exhaustion, it formed part of a larger pattern of physiological decline that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. He reached Camp 3 at 24,500 feet, well behind the lead climbers, arriving more than 2 hours after the front of the group had already settled into camp. At that altitude, even a small gap in time climbing starts to matter more than it should. The outfitter's high-altitude medic, positioned at Camp 2, conducted a brief radio check with climbers at Camp 3. Derek's blood oxygen saturation, the percentage of hemoglobin in the bloodstream carrying oxygen, a metric that can be measured with a fingerclip pulse oximeter, was recorded at 68%. The acceptable minimum threshold above which most high-altitude medical authorities consider continued ascent safe is typically cited at 75% or above. A reading of 68% at rest at 24,500 feet is below that threshold. It is the kind of number that, in a medical context below 14,000 feet, would prompt immediate clinical evaluation. The medic relayed concern via radio to the lead guide. The lead guide radioed Derek directly. Derek, responding on his handset from inside his tent at Camp 3, stated that he felt tired but functional and that he intended to push to Camp 4 with the group. His voice, by the account of the lead guide relayed later to the outfitter's review team, was coherent. He was not incoherent. He was capable of articulating a position and defending it. This is not the same as being capable of accurately assessing one's own physiological status. At 24,500 feet, with a blood oxygen saturation of 68%. But in the absence of a protocol that made descent mandatory at that reading, the lead guide logged the number, noted Derek's stated intention, and deferred. The log entry, the saturation reading, the radio exchange. The decision to defer was later identified as a documentation gap by the post-incident review, not because logging was wrong, but because the outfitter's protocol did not specify what action was required when a specific threshold was crossed, only that readings should be recorded. The distinction between recording a problem and responding to it was left to individual judgment in the field. In this case, individual judgment deferred to the client. The group departed Camp 3 well after midnight on May 7th for the overnight push to Camp 4 on the South Kernel. This section, up the upper Lhotse face and across the Geneva spur to the flat exposed plateau at roughly 26,000 feet, is among the most physically demanding segments of the Southeast Ridge route. Above this point, descent becomes increasingly difficult as the South Col has no direct exit except the route used for ascent, which is already far below. Derek began the climb on a 2-liter per minute oxygen flow and was slower than all other clients from the outset. Nima had been reassigned to him following concerns raised at Camp 3, but was also managing a rope cache task for the summit push, dividing his attention and limiting continuous monitoring. The team progressed through the darkness in a staggered line of headlamps, with Derek consistently at the rear and the gap between him and the lead climbers steadily increasing. He reached Camp 4 on the morning of May 8th, well after the faster climbers had already arrived and settled in. That delay mattered more than it seemed at first. Oxygen isn't just about how much you carry, but how long you're running it for. Because Derek took longer getting up, he'd already burned through more of his supply before the summit push had even started. When they checked his remaining oxygen at Camp 4, he was down to about 60% of what had been planned for the climb, less than what the standard expedition setup was meant to safely cover for a summit attempt. The summit push from Camp 4 is typically calculated as 4 to 6 hours of climbing to the summit and 3 to 4 hours of descent, plus buffer. In standard outfitter protocol, running oxygen at the prescribed 3 to 4 liters per minute during climbing, the supply margin is designed to cover the full round trip with a safety reserve. At 60% of planned supply, the math was tight. At the reduced flow rate Derek intended to run, 1.5 liters per minute, the compromised figure he had calculated at Camp 4, the math could, on paper, be made to work. Paper, at 26,000 feet, is an abstraction. The body performing the calculation is not. Nima radioed the lead guide at Camp 4 to flag the oxygen situation. The lead guide told Derek to think carefully about his options. Derek went over it himself, checked the numbers, and still said he was going for the summit. The decision was recorded, and no one stepped in to override it. No one really tried to shut it down at that point. It was more like everyone just accepted it and moved on. He rested through the day at Camp 4. Sleep at the South Col is rarely restorative. The elevation, the noise of wind against tent fabric, the difficulty of eating and drinking in the confined cold, and the pervasive awareness of what comes next combine to produce rest that is more accurately described as horizontal waiting. Derek dozed intermittently. His cough was present throughout. He forced himself to drink water and eat a partial meal of energy food that had been carried up by the collective Sherpa team. The camp was populated by climbers from at least 3 different commercial operations, all converging on the same summit window, all running similar calculations about oxygen, weather, and time. The temperature at the South Col overnight was approximately minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface. Wind chill from the prevailing winds pushed the effective temperature lower and into dirt to a range that, with full protection, a properly layered climber can endure. But that becomes rapidly lethal the moment insulation is compromised, consciousness dims, or the body's ability to generate heat is overwhelmed. At 10:30 p.m. on May 8th, Derek Pruitt departed Camp 4 with the main group for the summit push. He was carrying his remaining oxygen, his personal emergency supplies, his handset radio, and the specific knowledge that his margin was narrower than the outfitter's plan had been designed to accommodate. He was also, by the physiological accounting that would be reconstructed later, almost certainly in the early to middle stages of high-altitude cerebral edema, the accumulation of excess fluid in the brain tissue that is the altitude illness, counterpart to what his lungs may also have been developing. HACE, as it is abbreviated in the medical literature, does not announce itself cleanly. Its early presentation is fatigue, headache, and cognitive slowing, all of which are at 26,000 feet, indistinguishable from normal altitude response until they are not. Its progression is variable, but can be rapid. Its defining feature, from a decision-making standpoint, is that the organ responsible for recognizing the problem is the organ the problem is affecting. He knew the route from his research. He knew the landmarks, the balcony at 27,600 feet, the South Summit, the Hillary Step, or what remained of it following the 2015 earthquake, which had altered the feature somewhat, and then the summit ridge to the top. He had studied photographs and diagrams. He had read accounts. He had, by any reasonable definition of pre-climb preparation, done what a serious amateur could do without setting foot on the mountain. Within 90 minutes of departing Camp 4, above the balcony, Derek was the last climber in the line. Nima Gaeljan stayed with him. This is worth noting plainly because it matters. Nima, a 29-year-old Sherpa with no obligation, under a personal contract and every practical justification to pace with the main group, stayed with Derek. He shortened his own pace to match Derek's. He positioned himself on the fixed rope within a visible distance below Derek, which is the standard monitoring position for a support Sherpa. He watched. The other clients and their Sherpas were already 25 to 40 minutes ahead and still moving upward. The summit was above them. The night was clear, which in the death zone means something very different. Cold, still, and dark in a way most people never really experience. It's the kind of darkness where the only real light is your headlamp, and the stars overhead feel close, sharp, and almost harsh rather than beautiful. At approximately 28,200 feet, well above the balcony, below the south summit, at an elevation where the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere is approximately 1/3 of sea level, Derek's regulator indicated low oxygen. He had been climbing for 3 hours and 20 minutes. His pace in the final hour had been 5 to 8 steps before stopping to rest. These were not strategic rest stops. They were the kind of stops the body takes when it is no longer negotiating with the climber about whether to stop. Nima climbed up to Derek's position and switched him to the emergency half canister he had been carrying. That's the kind of thing you don't really plan on using like this. The emergency supply was not a full oxygen cylinder, but a contingency reserve intended to bridge short-term gaps, not support a summit push. The summit lay approximately 650 vertical feet above their position. In the death zone, vertical gain cannot be measured against normal climbing conditions. At sea level, 650 feet of ascent might take 30 to 45 minutes on moderate terrain. At nearly 28,200 feet, with a pace reduced to 5 to 8 steps between rest stops and oxygen flowing from a partial reserve, that same distance translated into hours of effort that could not be safely sustained with the remaining supply. Shortly afterward, at an estimated elevation of 28,250 feet on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest, Derek Allen Pruitt stopped moving forward. From here on, it wasn't really about progress anymore. Nima, positioned on the fixed rope approximately 15 feet below Derek, saw it happen. Derek did not fall. He did not slip. He sat down, or rather, his body settled sideways against the slope in the way that a person sits when sitting is no longer a decision, but a consequence. Nima climbed up to him. Derek was breathing. He did not respond to Nima's voice. He did not respond to a firm touch on the shoulder. His oxygen mask was in place, but when Nima checked the regulator, it was reading empty. The emergency canister had been exhausted. Derek's gloves were partially removed. removed. His right glove was off entirely. His left was pulled halfway down his hand. In the conditions present at that moment, approximately minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, effective wind chill, darkness, wind running at the low end of the forecast range. Bare skin at altitude loses heat at a rate that produces tissue damage within minutes, and life-threatening hypothermia within a range that depends on individual factors, none of which favor a man already compromised by hypoxia and cerebral edema. The removal of gloves in those conditions was not purposeful. It is a recognized behavioral presentation documented in both hypothermia and hypoxic impairment literature, in which the body's confused thermoregulatory signaling produces the paradoxical sensation of warmth at the moment the body is most critically cold. The person removing the gloves does not experience it as a symptom. They experience it as relief. Nima radioed Base Camp and Camp 4 simultaneously. The first radio contact was logged shortly after the situation developed at Camp 3. He reported an unresponsive climber at approximately 28,250 feet, oxygen depleted, with signs of altered mental status. His voice on the transmission, later reviewed from the radiolog, remained steady and controlled. The lead guide at Camp 4 began organizing a response immediately. 2 Sherpas who were staged at Camp 4 and had not yet begun their own summit push began preparing to ascend with additional oxygen canisters. At the elevation involved and the pace achievable with the load they were carrying, their estimated arrival at Derek's position was 90 to 120 minutes. That window, into an hour and a half to 2 hours, was the operational reality of rescue at 28,000 feet. There is no faster option. Helicopters cannot operate at that altitude. There is no vertical evacuation. There are only people climbing with oxygen toward a fixed point on a ridge in the dark. Over the next 40 minutes, Nima maintained contact with Derek. Derek regained partial consciousness twice, brief returns, each lasting less than a minute, during which he was present in the sense of having open eyes and some response to stimulation, but not present in any communicative sense. He didn't speak clearly during either moment. He came back around. Nima gave him oxygen from his own supply during that time, even though it meant cutting into his own safety margin. He didn't hesitate, just did it. Soon afterward, Derek lost consciousness fully and did not regain it. His breathing, which had been shallow for the previous 30 minutes, became irregular in the specific way breathing at extreme altitude becomes irregular. Longer gaps between inhalations, each breath shallower than the last, the rhythm gradually losing whatever consistency it had retained. Nima stayed with him on the fixed rope, maintained radio contact with Camp 4, and continued reporting what he was observing. Roughly an hour later, 2 Sherpas from Camp 4, Dawa Chering, 34, and Kelsang Dorje, 27, both with multiple prior Everest summits, reached Derek's position on the southeast ridge. The effective wind, chill at the time, was approximately minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time they arrived, Derek no longer had a detectable pulse. All 3 Sherpas, Nima, Dawa, and Kelsang, worked in rotating pairs for approximately 20 minutes, attempting resuscitation. At 28,250 feet, without mechanical resuscitation equipment and in conditions capable of causing frostbite in exposed skin within minutes, the physical limitations on rescue were severe. Eventually, the resuscitation effort was discontinued. The 3 Sherpas began their descent. Nothing really gets said on the way down. Everyone's just focused on getting back. Derek Allen Pruitt's body remained on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest. The terrain and elevation made recovery non-viable. It was not attempted. The expedition's base camp management notified U.S. authorities on May 9, 2016, and Derek's family in Texas was informed shortly afterward. Because his body remained unrecoverable at extreme altitude, no autopsy was performed. The official incident report concluded that he died from acute altitude illness and severe hypoxia after his oxygen supply became critically insufficient during the summit push. An internal post-incident review later identified 3 major contributing factors. The first was Derek's decision to dismiss his dedicated Sherpa, removing the one person most familiar with his physical condition and behavior at altitude. The second was the failure to enforce a descent after his oxygen saturation levels dropped dangerously low at Camp 3. The third was Derek's unauthorized reduction of his supplemental oxygen flow rates, which significantly reduced his safety margin during the climb. No legal action followed the incident. The next season, the expedition company changed its contracts so that climbers now had to sign a written agreement if they wanted to change the standard oxygen settings before or during the climb.